to this, the second of two panels happening consecutively in this first session of the Conference on Mysticism and Comparative Approaches to Peaceful Coexistence. We have with us this afternoon three renowned scholars, each of whom is well published, well researched in his own field of expertise. Each of our three speakers will have the opportunity to address us for about 18 or 20 minutes. And after all three speakers have completed their interventions, there will be a time for questions. Our first speaker this afternoon, who will be speaking on the topic of identity, prejudice, and mysticism, exploring sustainable narratives of peace across religious borders, is Dr. Paul Hedges, who is Associate Professor of Interreligious Studies in the Studies in Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies program in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is a well-published author. A number of his books occur in the biography that is given in the text of this program, and therefore I am delighted at once, without further ado, to hand over to Dr. Paul Hedges.
Okay, thank you very much for the very kind introduction here. Okay, thank you. As Dr. Clohessy says, my title is Identity and Prejudice and Narratives, Exploring Sustainable Narratives of Peace Across Religious Borders. And I will set out the paper through four parts. Firstly, what I've put down, against simplistic narratives of peace. Secondly, problematizing mysticism. Then a third part, identity narratives and violence in mysticism. And then finally a short sort of, well, not exactly a conclusion, but a short sort of forward sort of part of this towards narratives of religious coexistence, concluding beyond mysticism. Now, just to note, I'm not going to be reading my paper, and what I'm doing through the PowerPoint is more, as I put, an impressionistic outline of some of the key arguments for it. So the first part. Now, when we speak about religion, violence, and peace, we often hear two quite distinct narratives. On the one hand, advocates of dialogue will often tell us that true religion is about peace. If we understand religion in its core, then we understand that sort of non-violence, peace goes along with this. However, against this, we often hear another narrative from other parties, that religion is actually the cause of much of the violence in the world. It's an inherent sort of danger to us and a threat. And perhaps between these, from different scholars, we see a somewhat different framing. Perhaps most famously, Scott Appleby's notion of the ambivalence of the sacred, of course, one of his famous texts, talks about the idea that religion can be both a cause of violence and peace. And the German scholar Perry Schmidt-Leuker speaks of this as religion having what he calls the aspects of oil or water, that if it's thrown onto the fires of hatred, it can help to put it out as water, or else it may incite those flames even further. And so, if you like, from a more balanced perspective, we see that religious cultures of violence, hatred, and intolerance exist alongside religious cultures of peace, justice, and toleration. And both of these are mainstream in every religious tradition. We see both sides there. And importantly for this conference, as we're looking at what we're terming the mystical traditions, this violence is as readily seen in what we might call the mystical traditions as in other parts of those traditions. And I've just picked out a few examples here. So Bernard of Clairvaux, famous for his love mysticism, this idea of the soul in Jesus as lover, and given the title of the Doctor of Love. He was, however, a strong advocate of the Crusades. He spoke in favour of the Second Crusade, and he believed it was a Christian duty to kill Muslims. And importantly, in this, he believed there should be no mercy. You shouldn't even attempt to convert them first. Just go out there and slaughter them. This was very clear in his writings and advocacy around this. So how do we sort of reconcile, if you like, this love mysticism, the doctrine of love, with this violence against the Muslims? Again, particularly today, many will speak about the Sufi traditions, again, often framed as mystical, as being pacifists, and seeing the path, if you like, of jihad as inner peace. But if we turn back about sort of 100 years or so, or more, we see that they were a major impetus in anti-colonial wars. It was often Sufis who were the charismatic leaders who were at the forefront of fighting against sort of colonial forces. And I use this particularly today, because of course in our current context, people often speak about what they see as sort of militant forms of Islam today and see Sufism as the antidote to this. And we often see these narratives amongst many sort of policy makers. But if you like to imagine that somehow all Sufis are peaceful, it's certainly not a historically credible narrative. Again, if we take sort of Buddhism as an example, Zen Buddhism, again, often represented as the mystical school, particularly it's the meditation school. Chan is the Chinese dhyana for the Sanskrit in this. And as Brian Victoria has aptly shown through his book sort of Zen at War, they were some of the chief chaplains of the Japanese military in World War II, exhorting people to go out and kill for their country. So, if like mystical traditions are certainly sort of not a source of ironic understanding across traditions. Now, let's come to our second point on this, mysticism. Now, as a concept, Michel de Certeau has suggested it's got roots back to the 17th century, if you like, as this term, this concept that we know today. And we've seen it sort of framed in sort of academic sort of study through such figures as William James, Evelyn Underhill, Rudolf Otto, and so on, in sort of the early 20th century sort of onwards, to become, if you like, an assumed universal across sort of traditions. And there's a debate within sort of the study of mysticism as to whether this is universal. There's a constructivist school, and it is an ongoing live debate. Foreman was sort of a key part of this, and today perhaps Kenneth Rose is perhaps one of the best sort of advocates of this idea that there is, if like, some universal mysticism out there. But I'd like to take a slightly different track from this debate and look at one particular text, that is Grace Jansen, Power, Gender and Christian Mysticism, published in 1995. And I think she gives us perhaps the most significant critique of mysticism. Now, Jansen's book is an extremely sort of complex sort of work, and I'd like to sort of simplify it to two core arguments for the purpose of this paper. The first one, that mysticism is essentially sort of a created category, and this goes back, if you like, to Certeau's of how we use it. But also, Jansen argues that it legitimates control and authority. We give the name of mysticism to figures we want to extol. Of course, sometimes mysticism is used to disparage people and their ideas, but typically it's used to serve food. And within this, Jansen's experiences are often sort of sidelined. We have notions of what pure or correct mysticism is, and women who perhaps more often in periods visionaries get sidelined from this. They're not seen as being like at the highest levels of mysticism. So she sees a very gendered hierarchy into where our notions of mysticism are constructed. And again, as I've mentioned, looking at the history of this term. So throughout time in different scholars, we see very different sort of ideas as to what true mysticism is. And again, between sort of William James, R.C. Zahner, sort of Rudolf Otto, we see sort of different aspects of these traditions extolled as sort of the correct or true mysticism. And she also picks up a point on contemporary usage, that as we typically sort of see it today, it focuses upon the internalized and privatized belief experiences and downplays political and ethical aspects. And going back particularly into sort of the medieval sort of Catholic traditions she explores, she notes figures like sort of Eckhart, who spoke a lot about how we should sort of live and work. And she makes one particular quote from him that often gets sort of cited, that for Eckhart, the person who goes out and gives soup to the hungry person is doing better work than a person who goes inwards to their own spiritual experience. And she sees it as foregrounded these assumptions of pure experience over and above what we do in the world. Now, I'll turn here to a quote from Richard King in his book Orientalism and Religion, very famous book in the study of religion. And he gives perhaps a nice overview of what the problem is with this, the results, if you like, of what Jansen looks at. The privatization of mysticism, that is, the increasing tendency to locate the mystical in the psychological realm of personal experiences, serves to exclude it from the political issues such as social justice. Mysticism thus becomes seen as a personal matter of cultivating inner states of tranquility and equanimity, rather than seeking to transform the world, serve to accommodate the individual to the status quo for the alleviation of anxiety and stress. In this way, mysticism becomes thoroughly domesticated. Now, turning to the third part of my paper and some slightly different sort of issues to sort of help us theorize this, is that if Jansen is correct, that mysticism, as much as any other part of life, is a part of human meaning making. And it can be explored in the way we look at other social identities, and in particular, I'm going to take the lens of social identity theory. This comes from Henri Tajfar, 1980s onwards, very well established in social psychology, sociolinguistics. And it looks at the way we create in-group and out-group dynamics. And within this, the way that we have roles within society, prejudice and stereotypes of both ourselves and the other come out of this, and the way salience of identity works. I'll mention perhaps a few key aspects of identity as part of this. So firstly, identity depends on cultural, society, and context. We can't have an identity if your society doesn't say it exists. So you cannot be a king in a sort of a republic or a president in a monarchy, as a straightforward example. Again, to be a mystic depends upon what your society says this is. Again, our identities are always and only ever plural. So we don't see Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, they will belong to a particular tradition, in a particular country, a particular location. Gender becomes part of this. Basically, every part of us affects what we are. Again, I've mentioned sort of in-group and out-group, but very important in this, we put positive associations to our own group and negative to those we perceive as outsiders. And while the identities we have are never fixed, I've put here they're always becoming. We tell narratives. So what it means to be a mystic always sort of changes. And again, the notion of sort of intertextuality, what it means to be a mystic varies against, if you like, the other categories we create around religion, around spirituality, around all these other terms within our societies. And finally, just to mention sort of conflict, in a sense, we naturally come into conflict with those we see as others, but it's not inevitable. Certain sort of differences become aspects of tension, while other ones don't. And what I would like to suggest is that if, again, Jansen is right, and I think we should take her as correct in this, that what it means to have the identity or to be in a tradition of mysticism is always culturally variable. And that to be a mystic or to belong to these mystic traditions as much as anything else can be part of the wider sets of stories that we tell, the narratives that we have within our religions, within our societies. And again, sort of back to Schmidt-Leuchter, mysticism can be the oil or water aspect of tradition. It could be something that sets us against other people, much as it might bring us together. So the salient identity for a mystic, it may be peace for a while, and it doesn't adhere to some inherent thing we see across traditions that we might call mysticism. So as a result, this is just my own sort of thing up here, but I've put it in a slightly longer sort of bit of text. A Sufi may hate a Christian mystic, as much as a Zen Buddhist may hate a Taoist. An Advaita Vedantin Hindu may hate a Sikh contemplative, and not only vice versa, but also each may, in particular social contexts, kill the other as a good validated by their mystical pathway. and Bernard's demonstration of the Christian love of God was exemplified in killing Muslims without mercy. So sometimes in certain situations, our idea of what it means to love my tradition, to defend my tradition, can be violence against others. And I see mysticism, as I've said, through Bernard, the Sufi tradition, through Zen. We could go through all the traditions that people have called mystical and find, if you like, the way that they have been utilized for violence throughout history. Which brings me to my last part, that I don't think going to mysticism is an answer to the world's trouble. It will not bring us peace. And we need perhaps to look at how we create sort of narratives of peace, narratives of the religious other. I mentioned Martin Buber as an example here. As is perhaps well known, he gained his early fame, as if like as a mystic, into Hasidic sort of path. And he tells the story that one day a young man came to him in great trouble, but keen to get to his devotions, he turned this man away with a sort of like, haven't really sort of heard him out. And later that day, the young man committed suicide. And this was part of sort of Buber's sort of move, if you like, from mysticism to ethics, to act as if there is no God, that only you can sort of act within the world. Again, of course, through the 20th century, another Jewish figure incredibly influential in thinking through the other has been Levinas. I won't sort of say much, but for him, the key aspect is to be before the face of the other. For him, the other comes to us as someone who says, do not kill me. And it is this being for the other that is essential. And again, as I've mentioned sort of Eckhart, that if we see mystics as people sort of in these strange spiritual experiences, or however we want sort of to frame it, we can actually also read many of them in a different way. They talk about what we do within the world, and that is key. So what I suggest, we need to develop narratives of the other and ethical systems of relationality. And some figures, Carter Hayward, I think is important here, her notion of Godin, Buber, Levinas, I've mentioned, Thich Nhat Hanh as well. So rather than sort of positing sort of mysticism as a panacea to religious violence, which is something I think perhaps the framing of this conference has done, that we don't find the peace in mysticism, we find it only in narratives about the other, which sometimes do not come from the mystical traditions. And in Buber's case, it's moving from mysticism to ethics. And this notion of sort of relationality is sometimes sort of moving out from this essential notion that we move sort of, if you like, sort of upwards to this, to moving outwards to a horizontal human level. So my suggestion is, that we don't sort of perhaps discount sort of mysticism, but don't see mysticism as an answer to the problems that we're looking at. It can be the problem as much as any other framing of religious sort of narratives. It's part of what creates religious difference. And it's only sort of through creating sort of better narratives of the other, relationality towards them, that we will sort of see, as I've put it, sustainable narratives of peace, rather than simply calling upon sort of mysticism as an answer to this. Now, I hope I've got through this well within my time to give more time for discussion, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hedges, for that somewhat disillusioning talk, which is an excellent thing, because we need our illusions to be destroyed, especially our illusions about prayer and mysticism and holiness, and the images that come to mind when we talk about people like Bernard of Clairvaux, or talk about Meister Eckhart, and then the reality behind this. I'm sure at the end of the 3 sessions, we will have a time for discussion and for questions, and I'm sure that there will be a number of people, including myself, who want to ask for some clarifications and for some information. So thank you for that. Our second speaker, as far as I know, is not with us physically at this stage, but has sent forward a pre-recording of his talk. And our second speaker is from the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. It's Dr. Christopher Key Chapple. And his topic is Haribhadra and Religious Pluralism, a model for peaceful coexistence. Dr. Chapple, who has sent his talk to us, has also himself published a great deal in the field of interreligious topics Hinduism, Jainism, and yoga, and serves on the advisory boards for the Dharma Academy of North America, the Ahimsa Center, the Forum on Religion in Yale, the Jain Studies Center in London, the International School for Jain Studies in New Delhi. So I'm happy now to hand over to him, and his recorded talk will be played for us.
Good morning, and I'm delighted to be with you, albeit through video. And it's an honor to be back at Nazareth College. I grew up near Nazareth in Avon, New York, and have fond memories of many concerts there, including, when I was 14, Joni Mitchell. So when I saw the topic of this conference, I was really quite thrilled to participate. And in putting together this material, I want to acknowledge support from the Fulbright Nehru Foundation. And much of this work was completed while living in India during 2019. Now, the work of Haribhadra is actually quite fascinating in terms of its modern relevance. And what I'll be doing over the next few minutes is sharing some verses that are in the process of being translated, and talk about the relevance of religious pluralism over the centuries as a model for moving into peaceful coexistence. Now, this text, called the Yoga Bindu, was crafted in the 6th century, so about 1500 years ago. And the scholar who crafted it, Haribhadra Virahanka, is said to have been a convert from the Hindu tradition, himself a Brahmin scholar, who also had conducted profound, sustained studies into Buddhism and Vedanta, as well as his adopted faith, which is the Jain faith. He's also credited with developing early doxographies, that is, roadmaps to understanding the belief systems of other faith practitioners. And at ground, there are some commonalities that we see as themes appearing again and again. And I'm going to offer just 2 of them as a way for us to get a sense of his approach to pluralism and his way of encouraging peaceful coexistence. First is an acknowledgement of commonality. He states that all human beings yearn for freedom, and this freedom comes by many names. Through one's power, and this is a theme that recurs within his adopted faith tradition. According to Jain practice, we're on our own. We have to find within our own will the stick-to-itiveness to perform the acts that are needed to move us toward freedom. Through one's power, one becomes liberated if one's a Hindu, or awakened if one is a Buddhist, or ends the enemy of karma if one is a Jain. Second, ethics are held in common. And in the 6th century, the competing religious faiths, each with its own distinctive theology, where various styles of Hinduism, various schools and practitioners of Buddhism, as well as 2 major competing ways of performing and enacting the Jain faith. But what he sets forward in not only this text, but many others, is that one should develop friendliness toward those who possess goodness, sympathetic joy for those who have superior qualities, compassion for those afflicted with pain, and equanimity toward those who are without knowledge. And this is an ideal put forward in Buddhist literature, in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, as well as in various texts of the Jain tradition. Similarly, held in common is method. And regardless whether one is Hindu or Buddhist or Jain, yoga remains the practice through which one aspires toward freedom. And these beautiful verses speak to the universality of yoga as a way toward peaceful coexistence. Yoga is the best wish-granting tree, the highest jewel of consciousness, the source of dharmas, that is, teachings, things of the world, and laws. Yoga brings one to the perfection of the self. It is the fire applied to the seeds of rebirth. And all three traditions hold in common a desire to escape the difficulties of samsara and enter into that state of freedom. It is the highest maturity of the aged. It lays waste to all sufferings. It is called the death of death. The sharp weapons of passion are always blunted when they encounter actions suffused with tapas, that is, spiritual fire, and a mind protected with the defenses of yoga. Furthermore, stability, firmness, and faith are born from yoga, as well as friendliness, love for humanity, and brilliant intuition about things. Freedom from grasping produces acceptance of loss and gain. With the passage of time, it is inevitable that all externals will fade. Yoga increases joy, patience, and proper behavior. It brings about purity. It causes one to be received as a teacher with unsurpassed serenity and happiness. Indeed, success in this is seen today in learned people and women. This is often discussed in many other texts as well. So again, emphasizing common ground in freedom, in ethics, and in the performance of yoga. And by yoga, we will see it means a great deal more than merely physical exercise. It is said that those who know the yoga path, whose stains have been shaken off by the rigor of their tapas, that is, that spiritual fire, that those elevated ones who are established and possessed of yoga are the same, whether in darkness or in light, that one reaches a state of equanimity. Now, what are these practices of yoga? Okay, one of the practices is japa. And japa is prayer, essentially, regardless of tradition, recitation of prayer. Japa is said to be the initial practice to attain spirituality. From this limb arises divine grace. Hence, this is a way of cultivating insight. The object of japa is noble recitation. It is a hymn to the gods. It is seen that through this, sins dissolve, poisons are removed. It is advised for prayer to be formed either in front of a deity, or in a place where the water is pure, or in a beautiful grove of trees. Counting the joints of the fingers or telling the mala beads, like giving life to a son, one witnesses stability of breath at the tip of the nose. By oneself, one finds inner peace. In this practice of prayer, the measure of time is celebrated. From this, in not doing, one acquires the dispositional or emotional behaviors that characterize awakening. So finding repose in prayer, in recitation of holy words. This is praised by the noble sages. Purity arises from holding to this practice, from this dharma always arises, both at the time of doing it and following its performance. Next, we have Puja, and I do want to point out that these photographs are from my visits to India, and this is in the neighborhood where we were living in South Delhi at the time of Diwali, which is celebrated universally by everyone in India, Christian, Muslim, Jain, Buddhist, Shaiva, Advaita. Everybody loves the celebration of light in October. So what is this thing called Puja? It's honoring. The list of those to be honored is long. It includes women and men, mothers and fathers, teachers of the arts, the elderly, and teachers of Dharma. These vaunted people are to be acknowledged 3 times a day through bowing, or at least thinking about them. In a spirit of purity and faith, one should know how to do puja for the gods with flowers, food offerings, garments, songs, and turmeric. Householders should honor all the great souls of gods with a will and inclination that does not discriminate against any of them. All gods merit honoring, not just one preferred god. Those who worship all gods have controlled their senses. They have overcome their fears and difficulties. Again, finding common ground and honoring those who give honor, regardless of the object to which one directs that honor. Just as a noble woman seeks medicine to cure illness, this is the same for the one who seeks success in sloughing off the specific varieties of karma. One wishes for this in specific, excellent qualities arising from great knowledge, no aversion toward others, and excellent behavior. Thus, one arrives at the self. Another way is dana, giving. The gift is given for the benefit of both giver and receiver. Giving that might cause disease or unwholesomeness is not recommended. Giving is the primary practice of Dharma. Giving destroys poverty. Giving causes one to be beloved by people. Giving increases one's fame. This auspicious behavior announces disdain for worldliness. It shows concern for uplifting the impoverished, as well as gratefulness and sincerity. These were our hosts in Shantiniketan, so generous, so welcoming in every way. Now, specific aspects of yoga within this text. It announces a 5-fold yoga: spirituality, ethical cultivation, meditation, equanimity, and the quelling of inauspicious behavior. These 5 comprise the yoga that joins one with liberation. And again, in Jainism, the goal is to relinquish karmas, one at a time or in bunches, to attain the pilgrim state. The marks of a pilgrim are, and I think that all religious pilgrims share these, quickly pursuing the path, keeping the faith, obtaining the blessings of wisdom, being colored with the qualities of great being, and going with haste toward the truth that empowers. This Jain temple in Ramtek just indicates that we need to climb up those stairs as effectively as we can in pursuit of yoga. So, defining the 5. Spirituality. Great souls identify places of weakness and understand their various qualities. For the wise one who is free from delusion, spirituality consists of linking oneself to suitable actions, thinking about truths that have been spoken, and flowing endlessly in those ethical practices we looked at earlier. From this, sin is destroyed and illumination arises. Morality and knowledge become second nature. There is an experience of perfection, even in mortality. Bhavana Cultivation. Through repeated merit, ethics, one arrives at cultivation. The mind is connected in samadhi, a divine state. This connectivity is to be strengthened every day. This, indeed, is the practice to be known. From this, there is a reduction of impurity. One is inclined toward the practice of purity. Therefore, the good mind increases. This is the benefit of cultivation. Now, meditation, a mind state regularly residing in purity, is called meditation. It resembles an unflickering lamp. It endows a person with enjoyment of the subtle. The wise thus say, the conclusion of this yoga results in separation from attachment, stability in the midst of existence, and mastery at all times. Equanimity, the fourth state, is called equanimity because one abandons likes and dislikes within the realm of things that are manufactured by ignorance. One cuts the thread of expectation. One destroys subtle karma and strengthens the process of disengagement. And then we arrive at vritti sampakashaya. It is believed that whoever stops the behaviors that result from involvement with negative karma quells those karmas and no longer re-enters existence. This is liberative knowledge. One attains a total freedom. One attains liberation from all obstacles. One reaches eternal existence and bliss. This is a picture of Paryushan, the high holy days in the fall. This is in the Green Park Temple in South Delhi. Freedom. Those who are no longer bound to the past, whose souls have moved on from the ocean of existence, are not attached to karma in any way. They are joined to the soul. Eliminating karmas entirely is freedom. One gains victory over all afflictive enjoyments. So full circle, yoga knowledge is known to be the best. It creates the state of true practice. From this yoga, one attains the state of purity. It is said to have arisen in the jinnas, the sages of ancient times. It is a state of purity and faith. It is the matrix of boundless energy. It grants immortality to the heroic sages. Cutting off the sense of doer, one enters the final state, goes beyond all births. One becomes the best, separated from karmas, cutting them off with skill in yoga. From knowledge regarding karma's impure stickiness, and with skill in cutting off karmic bondage, one thinks only about the undying nature of self. This karma is not mine. It is better to be without it. In this final image, we see a depiction of a heavenly state. Actually, it's a state beyond the heavens, a state of perfect freedom, where the soul, no longer encumbered by karma, stands and gazes eternally with energy, awareness, and bliss. So thank you for listening to these verses, and thank you for considering Haribhadra's insight into the commonality of the religious path. In practice, in mystical experience, we get that sense of elevation, and a universal language for that path of elevation is yoga. Regardless of faith, yoga describes the good life, and I look forward perhaps to some email conversations, chapple@lmu.edu. Thank you very much.
So even though Dr. Chapple is not with us, I thank him nonetheless in your name for an important intervention. I think few people would doubt that together with the various emergent liberation theologies, the theology of religious pluralism is one of the most crucial areas now for any theologian who is involved either in study or in practical pastoral application of theology. Our third and final speaker this afternoon is well known to us here in Rome, Imam Dr. Yahya Pallavicini. His topic is Shaykh Ahmad bin Idris, Legacy in Europe, Intellectual Jihad and Eschatological Politics. Dr. Pallavicini is a graduate of La Sapienza University here in Rome, but has studied in a number of places, including Paris and Cairo. He is the president of the Islamic Religious Community of Italy, Coexistence, one of the principal organizations that represents Islam and Muslims living here in Italy. And he is deeply and always has been deeply involved, as were members of his family before him, in the building of relationships between Muslims and members of other religious communities. He was certainly present and was invited to be part of the Abu Dhabi Declaration on Fraternity by Pope Francis and Sheikh Tayyib. I'm happy, therefore, to hand over immediately to Dr. Imam Yahya Pallavicini.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you also for all the organizers for such a kind invitation. And I'm really honored to try to share and give a contribution on a very important general topic, which is, of course, sacred text and human context, but in the specific this year's conference on mystical tradition, approaches to peaceful coexistence, I feel that there is a link between the study of our sacred text, their implementation in the context of contemporary society, but also the contribution of mystical traditions for a specific goal such as peaceful coexistence. And I'll be trying to also somehow take advantage of the years I passed in PISAI in Rome at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies. So I hope this will be and somehow an occasion for developing these studies and this knowledge. As it was mentioned, I will try to speak mostly on two different terms. One is eschatological politics, and the other one is intellectual jihad. And I think, if I may say, my proposal is that these two term combinations can be keys for within the Muslim mystical contribution to the goal of a peaceful coexistence. Because according to the teaching of some of the mystical masters, the knowledge of the context means also the knowledge that there are relevant signs of the times in terms of eschatological time. So we are facing and living in a period of history and of society that is going towards an end. And so the urgency and the solicitude to deepen our spiritual and religious responsibilities is something that the masters of the mystical Sufi traditions have taught, especially in these last centuries, to have the knowledge of the context, which means an eschatological context, which means also an engagement in some areas of responsibility that could be also politics, which means try to find the link between our main concentration, which is knowledge for God in his mystery and in his knowledge, but also engaging in our citizenship role as believers in society, trying to inspire policies that can and somehow have a link with sacred universal values and not consider politics only as a individual earthly or worldly affair, detached and separated by any spiritual dimension and any religious universal value. So this is the first framework, and the second one would be the method. And the method is jihad, but not to be scary, is of course jihad in its true roots and dimension and interpretation within the traditional Islamic teachings, which means jihad aqli. It's an intellectual jihad. So it's jihad, literally speaking, in the search of the good, and in trying to avoid any error, any passion, any misleading interpretation of life and of our duties. But on the other side, it is also an intellectual challenge, which means that in somehow the search for good towards what are negative dimensions needs also an intellectual open-mindedness, and if I may say, illumination. So it's an intellectual research for our responsibility also in worldly affairs, in this peaceful coexistence of citizens and believers in our Western and Eastern societies, with the contemporary challenges that go back to the eschatological dimension, which is in somehow, unfortunately, the knowledge that persons have lost their reference to spiritual and religious values. In my paper, I start by some historical references, roughly speaking, going back to what was the Chaldean, the Egyptian, the Roman, or the Arab history, where formerly some rulers actually forgot their link and their role, and in somehow the management of territory and government was a sign of decadence, not recognizing the spiritual, ritual, and civil renewal of the monotheistic messages interpreted by the prophets in their times. So the idea is that maybe it depends also from us as Westerners in this contemporary society to carry out this reconversion of an Eastern metaphysics, studying the traditional doctrines as the Orientals do, but without falling into coarse behavior or an Orientalish or artificially Arabesque aesthetic. The community of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim believers in the West will benefit from these studies, at least as a possibility of healthy distinction, albeit a minor one, with regards to the reductionism of the act of religion to a social humanitarian doctrine or a humanistic ethics, regarding a manipulation of a religious form in a sectarian, judiciary, subversive, and pseudo-political absolutism, as unfortunately we can witness with some of the most radical interpretation and narrow-minded ideological misleading interpretations in this recent century. So between the vulgarization and manipulation of metaphysics, the search for sacred knowledge that is accompanied by the footholds and traditional support of the orthodoxy of religion, of the rigor and intellectual honesty, and of the contemplative vocation can perhaps be preserved thanks to the testimony of some interpreters and representatives of true monotheism, who know how to dialogue and cooperate in a brotherly way between themselves, connecting some correspondence of the challenges of contemporary society to the test of useful intellectual and initiatic tests, that are valuable for a change of mentality, the purification of the soul, and the spiritual progress of one's service of his invocation. According to traditional Muslim teachers, the effort to adapt Islamic doctrine, which is rooted on the text of the Holy Quran and in the teachings, hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, to the context of society and the changing world, can be interpreted by men and women who have the qualification and authorizations to connect the eternity of revelation to the science of the moment, Ibn al-Waqt, renewing the sacred communication and understanding of the doctrine in everyday life and in the different contexts spread throughout the various regions of the world. This relationship between the universal doctrine of the Quran and the Ahadith and the context of society has changed radically in history, from the government of Medina to the Abbasid Caliphate to the Ottoman Caliphate, throughout to our postmodern era, and has seen different adaptations in Morocco or Indonesia, India or China or elsewhere. The awareness of human decadence and trust in divine providence have thus inspired a quest for an intellectual reaction in every century, and has enabled the Muslim community to have certain enlightened representatives able to breathe life back into the intelligibility of the doctrine, and at the same time discover new insights and revelations as a reflection of the renewal of the holy presence of Allah. Commentators of the Holy Quran, such as Abd al-Razak al-Kashani in Persia, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti in Egypt, Ahmed Sirhindi in India, and Ahmed ibn Najib in Morocco, are some examples of this interior and exterior quest over the centuries and in various regions of the world. On a theological level, and as regards intellectual reflection on the sacred text in the context that develops, the same rules apply to judges, preachers, administrators, and sovereigns. Everyone must converge and contribute towards a higher harmony in the responsibility of a service that is characterized, as Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani taught, from the coordinated practice of humility and nobility. Thus, for centuries, the Islamic community has had the benefit of reference of the living tradition of the sacred text and their providential, numerous, profound, and useful interpretations of sacred science, spiritual guides, Imam Mujaddid, who renew access and usability to the symbolic and practical sense of the language, message, and mauyotics of Allah. Traditional passing on of the teachings of the Prophet, handed down and narrated by his companions to the present day, represent a chain of rings of loyalty and reliability over the centuries, which is the same method of initiatory reconnection that brings together teachers and disciples in the various contemplative brotherhoods of Islamic mysticism. To go to the Muhammadan way, in the 2 centuries of life between Junaid, died in 1910, and Al-Ghazali, died in 1111, these 2 teachers correspond to the intellectual opportunity to reread Revelation, both in the internal context of mysticism and in the external context of the Caliphate. Preventing breaks, but also excesses or extravagant alternatives, has been part of their intentions in public and traditional service. The need to control some ecstatic impulses is accompanied by an intuition and an in-depth analysis of the operative symbolism of Muhammad as a prophet and envoy, as a man and governor, as a servant, vicar, guarantor, fighter, and intercessor, but also as a teacher focal point and archetype at cosmological and metaphysical level as Uswa Hasana, an excellent model. The memory and knowledge of Allah remains the purpose of the religious life of the Muslim and of the seekers and travelers called to an integral vocation. What Abu Nasr al-Sarraj or Qadi Iyad or Abu Madian or Ibn Mashish or Ibn Arabi or Sharaf ad-Din al-Busiri introduced in different ways over a little more than a century between 988 and 1298 in various regions of the world is a contemplative devotion to the Prophet Muhammad as a key to penetrating revolution, as a support and guide for inner elevation, and as a protection in the world of external responsibilities. Qadi Iyad, to give just a focus on emulating his generosity, his determination, his courage, his good company, his righteousness, his justice, his spiritual retreat, and the cautiousness of Allah. Curiously, during the Abbasid Caliphate, the so-called closing of doors for the interpretation of the text of the Holy Quran also coincides with the opening of organized structures in the forms of mystical schools and brotherhoods of contemplative order of disciples linked to a living teacher. This teacher is the representative of the mastery of the Prophet Muhammad, who initiated the rule and the covenant of reconnection and his companionship. So it's a question of prophetic inheritance, the assimilation of internal sunnah, or the practice of the teaching of the Prophet, namely in somehow connecting with his spiritual conscience. It is a traditional adaptation of revelation and the vitality of the Prophet that offers a testimony and interpretation that also integrates variation at the level of external contingencies linked to temporal power, regional jurisdiction, political, economic, social responsibility, especially in period of crisis, decadence, corruption, and violence. Now, Sheikh Ahmed ibn Idris called upon his students and disciples to seek and recognize everything as directly related to the Prophet without intermediaries. For this reason, he called his rule at-Tariq al-Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadian way, because those who make the covenant have no other teacher than the Prophet himself, who is the one who takes care of spiritual needs and developments. His later follower, Sheikh al-Sanusi, would actually teach the work of the hands linked to the work of the mind. So you have these both connections, the intellectual in-depth study and the responsibility on a social level as well. And as Sheikh al-Samaluti taught, do not think that Allah's friends live in a retreat in their rooms and flee from the people in the caves of the mountain. Allah's sincere friends are those who live among the scorpions without ever being stung by one. They stay in the world and fight against the desires of the soul and fight individuals. Later on, one of his disciples, Sheikh al-Ja'fari, also included responsible commitment to work activities as the way of the religion and the way of the first generations in the method of Tariqa Muhammadiyya. Whether they are farmers, traders, weavers, or artisans, the method would have intensified the blessing for their inner benefit and in the work they carry out. It is no coincidence that in the development of the spiritual centers linked to this method, schools, hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and rooms for social and youth services have also arisen alongside places of prayer and ritual meeting. Now, unfortunately, the signs of the time, as I mentioned at the beginning, seem to confirm that a manipulation of religion has unleashed forces of hate and violence that seem to have been sidelined from the time of the so-called closure of innovation in interpretation during the caliphate of the Abbasid dynasty. These same powers created a falsification of the authentic spiritual and cultural Islamic identity, and provoked by a feeling of rejection of religion and the sacred in general. To this distortion, one must add the loss of conscience, traditional mentality and flexibility, and disposition to follow adab, a reference to God in the modern West. In this regard, a detail of the doctrine of the wasatiyya, the middle path, which takes its inspiration from the Quranic verse, must be interpreted also in Europe. Not only in the sense of virtuous middle way that overcomes oppositions and extremism, but also in the sense of a mediation that must make prevail the interpretation and testimony of the authenticity of methods, languages, contents, and the finality of Islamic knowledge and Western wisdom as well. The hope is to favor an exceptional synthesis of orientation and inspiration, of mediation and useful intellectual reflection that is useful for the discovery and development of human nature and its responsibility towards God and towards all creatures, believers, and citizens. The important consequence of this cultural convergence could have some interesting repercussions also at a juridical level, without creating normative deceptions, but by studying synergies on an ethical level with European jurisprudence and in various sectors of civil society with the essence of Islamic law, maqasid al-sharia, and the various possibilities that are present in the areas of food, health, commerce, and finance. That which we must avoid in this representation of European Islam is the infiltration of speculators who, instead of really working on the level of intercultural dialogue, take advantage of this situation to act as self-referential or ideological Muslim thinkers of Islamist formalism. We can perhaps call this small number of European Muslims Western representatives of the Sunnah Muhammadiyah, a current of men and women that from Morocco to Indonesia, from India to Spain, from Iran to Turkey, from the United Arab Emirates to Yemen, from France to Italy, renewed and adapt the intelligence of the Islamic faith with a nobility and humility, a dignity and patience, a depth and a simplicity that recall the qualities and virtues of the Prophet when he was guiding a small number of enlightened companions during the course of his life. The reference to the last day is not at all casual, because it is perhaps dealing only with the seed for a new generation of Muslims who will, in the next cycle, benefit from living in a context that is devoid of ignorance and forgetfulness, devoid from anger and pride, from corruption and violence, from arrogance and falsehood, the true enemies of any religion and culture, and the historical opponents of the first minority of Muslims in Mecca and the current minority of believers in the West as well as in the East, all believers. The eschatological understanding represents an incentive to solicit a supra-individual protection in the function of a traditional link of the populations to the brotherhood in the Nur Muhammadi, the primordial light of the prophecy that gives Muslims, but also others, the personal reason of the vision and fulfillment of the history in the world. To promote this renewal of culture, there is a need for representatives of all religious communities, especially Christian and Muslims, but also Jewish, who know how to express the awareness of their faith identity, but also mediate between the universal knowledge of the various religions and traditions of the East and West, with a perspective of religious and cultural enrichment and collaboration that respects the notion of unity within diversity. It is then necessary to know how to confront, with a critical but constructive spirit, the context of decadence and crisis of the postmodern culture in Europe. With regards
Imam,
to the
Pallavicini, hi. I think we're going to need to come to a close. Your topic is very interesting, but we are going to need to move on to our question and answer session.
Okay, shall I close the sentence?
Sure, if
then?
you want to do a very short closure, then you
Yes.
definitely can.
Well, then I'll just say that it is not a coincidence that fundamentalistic currents are worryingly successful among young Europeans who prefer the emotion of a violent excess to the emptiness of the values of modernity and technology. In this way, two extremism and parodies enter into a power struggle. On the one hand, the parody of emptiness and neutrality that risks being only an illusion of nothingness that fills itself with chaos, and on the other hand, the parody of excess and specificity that risks being a dangerous totalitarianism and egoistic deviation. This is where interreligious cooperation, according to this mystical approach, can hopefully help a better vision and a better implementation of the interpretation of the holy text. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Pallavicini, as I said, a great friend of us here in Rome and of the PISAI Institute. So it was delightful to listen to you. Thank you for re-underlining, for re-underscoring the word jihad in its correct theological and linguistic content. But thank you also for underscoring the idea of an eschatological politics, if you like, an eschatological cosmology that we share, that we're headed towards a particular point in time and therefore share a certain ethic. We now have a time for questions. We have about 20 minutes or so, just under 20 minutes for questions, and possibly the easiest way to ask a question is just to unmute and ask it. If we can keep the questions very brief, it will give our scholars, our two scholars who are present with us, more time to answer and to engage in this. And I might start the ball rolling, if I may, just for some clarification to both Dr. Paul Hedges and also to Dr. Pallavicini. This idea that there are two basic understandings in people who stand outside of religion. That is, either that religion is a violent thing that brings warfare and destruction, and that history proves this, or on the other side, that religion is a peaceful thing and is greatly beneficial to humankind. But there seems to me to be a third possibility, and that is the possibility of a religion that does not ever claim to be pacifist, a religion that makes no pacifistic claims at all. I'm not quite sure how many religions do, and this perhaps is part of what Dr. Imam Rashid Omar in Notre Dame calls the dilemma of the sacred, that the text is as moral as the reader. Whoever is reading the text, it is going to be that person's own morality that guides the interpretation. How do we account in religion, not for violence or for peace, but for a non-pacifistic stand, which seems to be the middle path?
Okay, shall I respond to this, please? Yes. Yes, I mean, if like those two poles I suggested, they are sort of like sort of the extremes, the ideal types, if you like. And I think most people would be somewhere between this. I wouldn't say they're sort of, I said stances of people outside religion altogether. I said we also see them particularly again sort of interfaith dialogue events. You see everyone turn up and say like, oh, we all believe in peace. So we, I see represented within traditions as well. Yes, I mean, absolutely. The non-motion defense is part of this. Traditions have long been part of this. So I'm not suggesting that these are the only options we have. Again, perhaps sort of just to bring it back onto the sort of interested in terms of sort of like sort of the mystical sort of traditions. Again, even if we sort of see this third path there, the question sort of becomes, how do we sort of manage that third path? And I think the bit you've picked up, and this is absolutely essential. Yes, you know, the hermeneutics is key. Is the reader come into this text with their own agendas and ideas that informs all of this. And I mean, particularly, of course, well, just to take sort of one example of sort of Cromwell with his campaign in Ireland. It may not be familiar to a lot of you, but Thomas Cromwell, we are told that before he went off to conduct his campaigns in Ireland, he sort of opened up his sort of Bible. I forget the exact verse, but it was one of these sort of bits of the Hebrew Bible, basically just go out and sort of slaughter indiscriminately. And this, we're told, sort of reflected how he did his campaign. Now, of course, on that page, there's a lot of other verses there, and the fact that he alighted on this one maybe tells us more about Cromwell than it does about the text itself. So yes, this is always an issue, and this, I think, is why, coming back, I said it's essential, if you like, to create sort of better sort of narratives. I mean, the texts are, in a sense, they're very dangerous tools. Like mysticism as well, I think, you know, if anybody sort of thinks there's some, you know, the text will give me the answer, particular experience will give me the answer, I think we always need to be very wary of that. And so we have to always be careful, I said, sort of to craft sort of narratives, the stories in which people come to these texts, come to experiences. And I hope that sort of, yes, answers the your question in some way.
Thank you, indeed. Perhaps Dr. Pallavicini might want to say a word about that. And then I have a second question from Sandra Epstein, which I will read, and it's aimed at both, it's for both scholars. Dr. Pallavicini?
Thank you. Yes, I think that is something which within the Muslim Brotherhoods has been part of a debate. How can we be consistent with the priority of a concentration for inner peace when in the world of responsibilities, believers and citizens and religious leaders are struggling to find a balance and to manage harmony. And according to the school of thought of the Muhammadan way, actually there is an update in terms of reaction and interpretation, as you mentioned, of the true original term of jihad in terms of an intellectual jihad. So we need to react. Unfortunately, the context is so decadent, and the manipulation of secular values or of religious doctrines is so evident that in order to help a consistent interpretation of our sacred text and the implementation in the context without any physical or military or violent revolution, we need to actually really be outspoken, trying to give some insights and guidance and inspiration, even in the public intellectual debate. And this is part of, I think, the reaction that is requested. And if I may say, many of the even interreligious engagement in these last years or decennies having somehow been framed, I'm speaking of a common word or the message of Amman. So even intra-religious dialogue and interreligious dialogue and the Marrakesh Declaration have been somehow inspired also by members and masters of this interpretation of a peaceful reaction, but with the knowledge of a very difficult intellectual challenge.
Thank you for that. For those who want to address a question to Dr. Chapple, his email address is up on the chat screen. Now there's a question from Sandra Epstein to everyone. Can each of you cite what you see as a challenging aspect of your respective studied traditions that needs to be understood by others, so that we can come together celebrating what we share and having regard and respect for where we differ? Perhaps we could start with Dr. Hedges and then move on again to Dr. Pallavicini.
Right. Okay, thank you, Sandra, for that question. It's a good question. I study a number of traditions, so that gives me various things that I could speak into. I'm initiated into the Christian tradition, so I will speak out of that, and maybe from the local context, because I'm in Singapore. At the moment, I've been here for the last 6 years, and within sort of perhaps interfaith sort of circles, there are particularly groups, I say Protestant sort of Christians, and their understanding of mission, evangelization, which does sort of sometimes cause tensions here amongst the other sort of communities. If you like, their desire to sort of spread what they see as the good news that has come to them is often, if you like, sort of seen as an act of sort of hostility, of a lack of sort of harmony. Amongst traditions, again, particularly in families when people convert. And I think that this is perhaps something for many Christians that need to be sort of dealt with. Of course, there's been a lot of sort of church sort of documents on this, particularly from the Catholic Church in particular. They have spent a lot of time trying to sort of tease out sort of where this is. And I think this is sort of remains an issue for many, many Christians across sort of all denominations. You know, to sort of try and sort of get a balance between these. I'm not going to say there's a simple answer to it. My answer to it, I think, is one that would not be acceptable to many other people, as I tend to come from a very sort of pluralist kind of sort of background, and I realise, particularly here theologically, I'm not in the same ballpark as most of my fellow Anglicans where I stand. But it is something that, again, you know, I think the communities here, they realise in an incredibly sort of multicultural sort of society, you know, you can't sort of go out and sort of offend people or give this perception of offence within this. So ways to sort of balance that, I think, is a key aspect of this.
Thank you. Dr. Pallavicini?
Well, to be brief, I would say that some of the challenges internally we try to face, to manage, is, if I may say, the lack of knowledge and confusion between what is relative and what is absolute. So too often, something that is relative, although it is important and can be part of the doctrine or the symbols or the rituals or the juridical interpretations of a religion, is taken as an absolute truth. And so there is a problem of what I would say a science of proportions. So what is relative is taken as absolute, and as a consequence, what is absolute is forgotten. And in this unbalanced situation, some, I would say, narrow-minded radical ideologies would take Islam only as a juridical, ethical way of life, especially considering prohibitions or punishments, forgetting all the spiritual dimension, which is not only mystical, but is also very normally religious dimension. So, and on the other side, you would find, if I may say, reformists that try to create an artificial Islam or an artificial other religion according to postmodern ideologies and fashions and interpretations. There again, there is a lack of balance of proportions and of authenticity. We need to renew the reading and the interpretation of the doctrine, but it's an access through an intellectual open-mindedness towards the eternity and absoluteness of God's language and truth. So this is something that is specifically within the spiritual and religious dimension. And of course, it's different from every religion to the other, but the principle, I think, at the end is the same. And I would say maybe to conclude, the issue would be also how to interpret as a believer, for instance, as a Muslim, the possibility within the mystical dimension of behaving and opening one's heart to the discovery of what is called Insan Kamil, the universal man, which of course has, according to the Islamic teachings, the Prophet as a paradigm, but of course it's a symbolical, although it is also a practical paradigm, but I think that every believer, especially if it has a search for a deeper sacred dimension in life, is open to a universal dimension of values and of wisdom. And this is exactly, might be, as I may say, part of the solution, because on the other side, you find this lack of harmony and lack of proportion. So the universal dimension is maybe the key to rediscover proportions and the goal and the consistent methodology within each one's religion.
Thank you. There's one more question that we could talk about. It comes from Rebecca Blackburn to both scholars. She is talking about that concept of the middle way, the wasit, that Dr. Pallavicini mentioned, and she quotes from a newly published work by Rabbi Rachel Mikva, the dangerous religious ideas, the deep roots of self-critical faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. She argues that all religious ideas are potentially dangerous, but that religious traditions have preserved and have passed down tools that are able to foster self-critical capacities, and that by practicing self-critique, religious adherents can guard against the destructive possibilities of religion and cultivate the blessings of religion instead. And in fact, this idea of self-criticism is something that I've been picking up among a number of theologians of late. So she asks, how does this perspective of self-criticism, which brings out the blessing and puts an end to the destructive possibility of potentially dangerous ideas, how does this speak to the theses that you have put forward this afternoon, starting with Dr. Hedges?
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Rebecca, for your question. I will just say sorry to Pamela. Apparently there's a complaint about my audio causing problems. My line has been breaking in and out a bit this evening for some reason, and I dropped out completely at one point earlier on, so hopefully it will remain stable. I have to say, I can't speak directly to the book. It's on my reading list. I've ordered a copy, but I haven't yet read this Dangerous Religious Ideas text. But yes, this idea that all religious ideas are potentially dangerous, to some extent, I would say, well, yes, every idea is potentially dangerous depending upon sort of how we take it. And again, speaking again, well, not just from a Singaporean context, sort of much of the whole East Asia, sort of Far East, the notion of harmony is incredibly important here. And of course, in one sense, harmony is a wonderful thing. But of course, it can also be an incredibly destructive tool where people cannot voice their ideas for fear of breaking sort of the, this relationship that should be there, this ideal sort of relationship. So people, feel that they're used their ideas can't come out within this. So even lots of sort of very positive sort of things have got a sort of a very negative side to them. Again, it's not just religious ideas, all human ideas have got their positive. And of course, my fellow sort of speaker, Dr. Pallavicini, if I've got your name right, sorry for mispronunciation, was speaking about sort of secularism, and I agree there are dangers in secularism. It's also an incredibly powerful tool for good, and we've seen this in sort of modern society, the way that sort of the secularism has provided to some extent a neutral space for religions to sort of mediate their differences. So absolutely everything can be used and abused in different ways. And I've spoken about social identity theory, and I think the way that we understand the way that humans create their identity against others helps to explain the ways that, that we weaponize certain ideas. Now, how far religious traditions sort of help within this self-critical thing? I think here partly of Catherine Cornell, her work on the impossibility of dialogue. I hope many of you know her work on this. She's spoken of humility as an important part of dialogue. And she says it's not a natural part of many traditions. We don't like really to criticize ourselves and look at our own sort of weaknesses and faults. So yes, I suspect that Rabbi Mikva in her book has picked up a good point, that there are these traditions there, but I suspect they're often, if you like, sort of subaltern traditions. They're not the majority ones there. And yes, a reformulation of the way that we do religion is important, but it's one that doesn't come naturally to us as human beings. Again, the whole in-group, out-group stuff, we're very bad at self-criticism in many ways, particularly when we see our traditions under attack or threatened in some ways. So again, the narratives that we make around this are extremely important.
Thank you for that. Dr. Pallavicini, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes, if you can squeeze a response into those 2 or 3 minutes before we finish. Thank you.
Sure. Well, then to squeeze it, I would say that according to the education I try to follow, religions are a very powerful and dangerous discourse. Yes, it depends for whom and for what. And the answer is for the ego. For the ego, every religious discourse is a very powerful and dangerous narrative. But apart from the ego, because the ego is, if I may say, the enemy of a spiritual, peaceful knowledge dimension. And so, of course, in terms of the interior combat, the ego tries to defend itself and to find alternatives for a self-satisfaction that goes beyond and as an alternative to any religious doctrine and teaching. So on the other side, of course, in terms of self-criticism, I think that I agree that never any scholar should be apologetic of his own interpretation, and neither the religious leaders of a specific religious dimension should be apologetic or exclusivistic, thinking that they have the truth and the absolute truth, and all the others go to hell. So, of course, so this is not according to my viewpoint, a wise interpretation of a specific true dimension within any religious doctrine and community. But on the other side, let us be careful to confuse the intellectual role through doubts. No, the goal, at least according to the Muslim master, is certitude. And certitude can be attained, as it was mentioned before, through humility. Starting from humility and attaining the goal of knowledge, one has to somehow control the ego and eventually open to the discovery of God's mystery. This is eventually the true peace for, at least according to a mystical dimension within Islamic orthodoxy. And I think that different ways and methodologies can find the same goal in different religious denominations as well. Thank you.
Thank you to our three speakers, Dr. Paul Hedges, Dr. Christopher Chapple, and Dr. Imam Pallavicini, for three informative and articulate and important interventions for this panel. Thank you too for all of those who were able to and who chose to join us for this particular discussion of religious pluralism and of mysticism and of so many other important issues. The organizers ask that you won't forget, please, to fill in one of the evaluation forms, which you will find on the same page in which you entered into this discussion. They'd be grateful if you would do that. So thank you to the organizers, thank you to our three excellent panelists, and thank you to all of those who joined us with questions and who joined us simply by being present, and blessings of peace to all of you.